Hey guys, this is Kevin Kane with Precision Powerlifting Systems. I'm joined, this time actually, it's probably for the first time in a while, by Jay Birdie of Jay Birdie Fitness, a PPS company. So this one I actually wanted to make a little bit different than some of the other ones because I think I talk a lot about what we do, but I don't necessarily cover what PPS is, our philosophy to training, like those types of things. Maybe get into a little bit more of my philosophy because I think what we do extends beyond the actual weight room. But in the weight room, we do things a lot different than other people. Like we don't run these run-of-the-mill programs. We're trying to kind of carve our own path without forgetting, those that started the path before us. So I kind of want to dive into some details on what PPS is and what makes it different. What gave me this idea, so every week I send out these weekly emails to my lifters. And in a lot of cases, it's like, hey, I see a lot of you guys doing this, focus on this one aspect. Or a lot of times it's a lot of like mental coaching and stuff. Just trying to keep everybody focused on the process as opposed to external outcomes, telling stories, showing good, some strong lifts that happened during the week, or explaining something that may have come up in training that I feel is appropriate for us to discuss. On top of those weekly emails we do, so those who are in tier 1, we have bi-weekly meetings where we break down videos in slow motion. We go over certain things. I go over things that have gone on in the last 2 weeks that I feel everybody needs to hear, or things that I've learned in that period of time, and maybe some decision-making stuff that had come up that I think others can learn from. So it's a continual process where we learn from each other and we have constant communication. I think what I did initially, when did I send this email? Maybe 2 weeks ago. I had so during this time, like with quarantine and all of that stuff, a lot of people have kind of lost their way in terms of powerlifting. So I wanted to help everybody kind of refocus their attention. And, we got a lot of people who are training in their basements by themselves, limited equipment. Like some of that stuff is still going on. And we can't lose sight of the things that matter, our attention, our focus, our intensity, those types of things. So one of the things that I thought would be important to kind of regain some focus in training was to have the lifters think about their why for powerlifting. So I sent this email out. I explained my why for this sport. And it's not these generic baseline answers, but a personal reason that is deep down into your soul on why you continue to do a sport that is going to be centered more around failure than it is going to be centered around success. And I got back a ton of responses. So some people shared it publicly, others emailed me privately or texted me privately.
How many responses would you say you got back?
I bet 75-80% of the team did it.
That's great.
So it was a lot, and they were very well thought out. A lot of people didn't send them back right away. They put a lot of thought into them, and some were a week later, 2 weeks later, because I think it's one of those questions that you really don't know the answer to unless you sit down and you really break it down.
Bev made a TikTok.
Well, great. So now the Chinese have access to Bev's reason why for powerlifting. But what it made me think of was there's probably not another team out there that does these type of things, right? You basically have a coach that gives you a program. You run the program. You probably put some notes in the program. They give you the following week. And that's just kind of how the process goes. And that's not how I do things because I don't think it can work, of course, that way, but it's not going to work to the greatest extent as if you're going to have real conversations with people and you're going to help try to direct their focus. This sport can teach you a lot about just character traits that are going to take you further in life than it probably ever will on a platform. And I think we need to remember those things. And our job as a coach is to guide humans, not just in the sport of powerlifting, but so that they can learn the lessons that the sport will provide so that they can be successful outside of the platform. So I gave this, Joe Frazier had said this, that are champions aren't made in the ring, but they're recognized in it. So if you take ring and you remove that and you put platform, right? So like champions aren't made on the platform, they're just recognized on it, right? So what he was saying when he had said that was like all the hard work that you do behind the scenes when nobody's looking is the stuff that really propels you to be an elite level athlete. But it's that stuff too that can also carry you out in life. So one of the things that I told them is our platform just may be different for each individual. So there are a couple lifters on PPS that might have some higher levels of success in the sport of powerlifting where their recognition on the platform will be that platform in powerlifting. But for the majority of people that take part in this sport, it's not going to be on that platform. There's very few world champions, very few world record holders. When you look at, I understand records get broken all the time, but the amount of people holding world records is a very small number compared to the amount of people that actually do the sport of powerlifting. So maybe somebody's platform is a job interview, finishing a PhD, getting promoted at work. Like there's all kinds of different platforms that we're going to stand on that we can be recognized on, and the traits that we build in the gym can help prepare us for those moments and can help us succeed in those moments. Like this sport, it's going to build discipline, it's going to build perseverance, it's going to make you want to quit, but you're going to have to dig down deep and find a reason why to take that next step forward. So I think as a coach, it's our job to hold that philosophy that this sport can teach you not just about lifting weights and getting stronger, but you can make stronger human beings in and out of the gym that can carry on into their everyday lives. And I think it's our job to guide that process. And ironically enough, I think if you focus on the human being and you give them the traits to be successful as a human being, it just carries over onto the platform as well. Like one kind of feeds the other. And I understand there are some shitty human beings out there that do well in this sport, but they typically are just going to be remembered as assholes while they're lifting, and people forget about them the second that their totals start to go backwards or they're not involved in the sport. So it's important that we build those character traits. And for us, I've always said I only want to coach lifters that want to compete at a national level. Now, in that statement, I never said that they have to compete at a national level. They just have to have that mindset that they want to be competitive in this sport. They have to have as much buy-in as a lifter as I have as a coach, and they have to give me the same effort back that I give them. That's the only way that this works. Otherwise, it gets frustrating one way or the other. And I understand that there are people who want to do this sport a lot more recreationally. And there's nothing wrong with doing it more recreationally. I just don't think you can learn as many life lessons from just kind of going through the motions, coming into the gym, hitting your training occasionally, missing days to hang out with friends, stuff like that, that you can learn from actually having the discipline to try to work towards a specific goal. One of the reasons why I have that thought process is I grew up around sports. Like I played soccer through college, I did the MMA thing for over 10 years after college, and then I got into powerlifting after that. So sports has been a huge part of my life. And without having that background in sports and the character traits that it's instilled in me, I don't think I would be as successful as a powerlifting coach now as I am. It helped me, I put myself back through school. I got a master's degree. I've done a lot of, in the face of adversity, I've been able to overcome many obstacles to get where I'm sitting today because of a lot of the character traits that sports built in me. And when I didn't have a real male role model at home that I could look up to that built those traits, I had those role models playing my sports, whether it was kids who were a little bit older than me on my teams, whether it was coaches. I've had a lot of positive influences from the amount of people I've been around that have helped guide me to get to where I am today. And I think that's really important. And I think this sport, because it has easy accessibility, it doesn't require a lot of money to get started, very little equipment, and anybody can lift weights. Like one of the reasons why that a few of my lifters said was because athletically they suck at everything else, but they were able to do this sport. And if they worked hard enough and stayed consistent enough, they were able to do pretty well and constantly get better. So that's That's a great thing about this sport, because I think a lot of people miss out on the opportunities that sport can teach because they don't have the necessary skills required for certain team sports or to play at certain levels. And this sport grants that opportunity. And it grants that opportunity by allowing you to do it amongst the world champions. So it's the one sport that you literally could be competing in your first meet ever, and you could be stepping on the same platform as somebody who's won multiple world championships. And that's pretty cool, and that can teach some positive lessons. I think at the same time, too, it can make you feel insecure, I guess, about how much you're lifting, and it's constantly in front of you that these people lift this much, you lift that much. But that's also an opportunity to help get better, to focus on yourself, and realize that life at the end of the day is just a race against yourself. You're not really racing against anybody else. We just get in our minds that we are racing against others. So a huge part of my coaching philosophy is focusing on those intangibles, which is why I had put out that email asking them to give me their reasons why they do this sport. And when you hear the lifters' reasons why, the personal reasons, it makes a lot of sense. Like, they didn't get into this sport to impress anybody on Instagram. They didn't get into it because of this person or that person, or they wanted to look cool, or they get into it because they had a reason. Or I shouldn't say they got into it because they had a reason, they stayed with it. So they might have got into it because somebody's like, hey, try powerlifting, or they see something on the internet and they're like, that looks cool, and they get into it. But then the sport does something to them that makes them stay with it. And those are all personal reasons, and I think knowing those personal reasons, you can help that person grow, not only in their total, but outside of the gym. And if you think of any great coach, like John Wooden, Nick Saban, they talk about raising young men at that college level. And I understand that the majority of the people I have are adults, and they've learned a lot of life lessons along the way. But some of these lessons, like I said, they weren't afforded the opportunities because they didn't have the necessary skill set to perhaps play in a sport or do some other organizational event that allowed them to kind of learn these lessons. And you do kind of learn them going through life, but it's not quite the same as something you do consistently for a prolonged period of time. So that's always been huge to me, is that philosophical part of coaching. Another piece of it too is like, and this is more like personal for me, I didn't get into coaching to just follow along with what other people do. So I think when you look at the majority of coaches that are out there that coach powerlifting, their programs all seem the same to me. It's some ripped off daily undulated periodization program, and there might be minor tweaks to it. Like maybe one person uses a little bit more variation, one person uses a little bit less, maybe one person has a little bit different reps. But at the end of the day, all of the programs, I shouldn't say all, but the majority of the programs that are out there tend to look the exact same. And I've never wanted to be a run-of-the-mill anything that I've done. I've always wanted to stand out, work hard, find my own way. Like leave a legacy at the end of the day. And I think it's the job of modern day coaches to pick up where the ones who came before us left off and to continue to make progress moving forward. Our job is not to reinvent the wheel. And don't get me wrong, I went through periods of time where I thought I could reinvent the wheel. But I think there's, this learning process that every coach goes through, and I call it the teenage angsty years, right? Like every teenager at some point rebels against their parents. And they just do things to basically be like, fuck you to their parents. But eventually over time, as you get older, you realize that your parents know a thing or two and you kind of come around. And I think that happens like even in the life cycle of coaching. Like there was a period of time where I was like, oh yeah, no, fatigue's bullshit. We can just do whatever we want. And I had to learn those lessons the hard way, but also in doing it, it allowed me to learn and to be okay with making mistakes, come back around. I realize now that it's not my job to reinvent the wheel. It's my job to take the torch that those that came before us and to build upon what they were building and then to pass it off to somebody else later on. And not that I've been doing this a long time, but it's been over 6 years now, and I feel that puts me as one of the ones who've been in this sport longer than most. I feel most people don't even last 5 years in this sport. So the fact that I've been around a little bit longer than that, but I've been around, some of the best lifters and coaches that have ever partaken in this sport. I've had conversations with some of the best lifters and coaches. I think that's allowed me to gain a lot more experience than maybe my time in the sport has allowed me to gain. So when I decided to stop reinventing the wheel, one of the things that I went back and actually looked at were my programs when I worked with Boris Shako. I went back, I reread Super Training, I reread Zatsiorsky's Science and Practical Applications of Strength Training. I reread Louis Simmons' Book of Methods. I even reread Squat Every Day. And some of those texts, not texts, some of those books that I can't even think of. Oh, like Charlie Francis's stuff. There was a bunch of stuff that I read when I had less perspective that I went back and read a little bit more recently to have that perspective that my job's not to reinvent the wheel, it's to take the similarities between all of them, my experiences as a coach, what I've seen work, what's worked for them, and to kind of put something together. So one of the things that I had realized was, and I kind of talked about this, there was a podcast that I did with the data-driven strength guys that got published today. But I had talked about how when you look at the macroscopic view of a Shako program, so one of the things, and I always knew that this was really important information, was that Shako's lifters competed 4 to 6 times a year. And his comp cycles, you'd hit 90% 4 weeks out, short little taper. You'd test the following week, taper down to the meet, and then you would obviously hit 90+%. One to two of those competitions would be ones that they would try to PR at. But the others, they were hitting over 90% of those singles. So when you really backed up and you're competing every 4 to 6 months, they're hitting 90% much more frequently than what people give credit to for a Shako program. So it's one of the things that I really thought about looking at, when I looked back at it, is for every month or two of volume work, they're getting a month where they're getting a lot of exposures to 90+% weights. Louis Simmons obviously has a max effort day, upper and lower in his programs. Obviously a lot of weightlifting programs use higher intensity stuff. Charlie Francis talked about a high-low approach. So high intensity days where his sprinters would run 95 to 100%. But then the low days were low days. He stayed out of those middle grounds. Simmons stays out of those middle grounds. I would say Shako stays out of those middle grounds because he uses a lot of sets and lower reps. So you're never really getting a ton of intraset fatigue. It's just a lot of repetition for that technique, even in the volume work. And then during a comp cycle, it's a lot of 90+% work. So when you're starting to look at all these programs and the similarities in that, so Shako's was just more clustered, where Charlie Francis was more weekly, Louis Simmons was more weekly. It made me think that this is where I need to focus my attention on the programs, is when I want high intensity stuff, I need to be specific with the high intensity work that I'm looking for. And if I'm trying to do technique work or if I have some other reason to do stuff, I need to have a reason to put the intensity higher than typically what we do now in our other days. So lower intensity work has a place. I recognize that with the Shako program. I wouldn't necessarily say that Louis Simmons' dynamic effort day is a low intensity, but they're certainly not higher intensity. I would say they're they might get up to moderate to heavy weights, but they don't have equipment on, and as a percentage of their 1RM for their equipped lifts, the percentages are probably pretty low. Even though it's hard work because you're adding time constraints to it. So the time constraints is something that I've used a lot in the programs, even though I don't do West Side style dynamic effort stuff that frequently. Sometimes we do. It's more maybe technique based, but I will use very light weights and then maybe put a time constraint on it just to make it feel heavier. And also that fatigue challenges technique a little bit more. So there's reasons to everything. So then I started to think, all right, so why not just copy Louis Simmons' program? Well, for one, the people that he's coaching are very elite lifters and they're multiply. So some of the things I think are different, like when you look at how much gear they have on at the bottom, right? So that top end strength, so raw lifters probably need less bands and chains. I'm not saying less exposures to them. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more, but the overall weight at the top, you probably need a little bit more in the whole. Single ply is somewhere in the middle of the two. So there are things you need to think about. And when you think about the West Side lifters, they tend to be larger, lift bigger weights, use a lot of gear, right? So for us, they don't deadlift a lot either. And that was something that I had a major problem with is I don't have, he's got elite lifters. Most of my lifters have been lifting for 5 years or less. Actually, all of them, but maybe one or two have been lifting for 5 years or less. So they're beginners, so they need more exposures to the actual movements. So I didn't want to just take out deadlifts and not deadlift that frequently because I do think that they need to get those deadlifts in there. But I needed to figure out a way that we could deadlift heavy in a week and squat heavy in a week. So, when you get back and you start getting back to the basics and the fundamentals, I think whether you're a lifter, a field or court athlete, whatever it is, getting back to the fundamentals of your sport, even as a coach, I think are really important at times because you can lose sight of those fundamentals. And typically, the ones that use the fundamentals the best are the ones that are most successful. So when I'm rereading, like Super Training and Science and Practices of Strength Training, you're starting to see the recovery periods for these things. So don't get me wrong, like systemic fatigue, I think builds up over time. But I was like, all right, if I can space out the heavier exposures between squats and deadlifts for heavy singles, if I can space them out 72 hours apart, I think we can be okay. And if I can give 48 hours in between a squat and a bench, right, chances are there are times that it's probably going to be 72 to 96 hours between a squat and a deadlift. But we had to keep in mind that systemic fatigue builds up. So our day one, we do our squat max effort, our day two, bench max effort, and our day three will be a deadlift max effort. And typically those are Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So if I'm squatting heavy on Monday, that means I'm not pulling heavy till Friday. But you got to remember the other way around. So Saturday, Sunday, then I'm back to the squats on Monday. So one of the things that I needed to keep in mind was I don't think, that overall fatigue just builds up from one session. Like, of course there is some, but it's kind of a continually ramping up to that max effort that I think actually becomes fatiguing. So Charlie Francis talked about like old gym lights. Like all the energy is used ramping them up, but leaving them on, there's not a lot of energy used. So it's how many times you're going to ramp up in a period of time that's actually going to drain the athlete. And I think this holds true. And so when you're looking at, 48 to 72 or more hours, like you want enough breaks in there. So I don't think it's necessary to pull a heavy deadlift every single week. I think some technique stuff on the deadlift can go a long way, especially if we're still getting a squat max effort. So I was like, all right, if I look at it from a bigger view, we just don't look daily and we just don't look weekly. If I look at like a monthly and a longer view, if I deadlift heavy every other week, that means day one, squat max effort, day two, bench max effort, so that's Wednesday, right? And then I don't have another max effort lift until I come back to that following Monday for a squat. So for a lower body max effort movement, I'm going a full week before I get another one in. In terms of, because there is systemic fatigue that builds up, even though you squat and then you bench, even though it's upper, lower, whatever, there is this accumulation of fatigue that builds up from the combination of those. So then I'm even going, I got Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. There's 5 days in between max effort exposures. So when you look at a lot of the higher intensity research, one of the things that really catches my eye is the amount of burnout. Now, granted, these study participants are not necessarily powerlifters that are motivated to hit 1 rep max singles or find it fun, and they may not be well equipped psychologically to handle those heavy singles. I still think it's important to know that, because even Louis talks about like depression, anxiety, and some of those are byproducts of training heavy singles frequently. So I wanted to make sure that I was giving enough breaks throughout a program and that it would be individually based. So just by having that one heuristic of deadlifting every other week and make sure that we're going at least 5 days without a max effort exposure. Now, one of the other heuristics that I had built in was if we hit a true 10. So all the lifters are told to leave 5 to 10 pounds on the bar for the following week. So think hard second, easy third for that max effort lift. And then we'll come in and we'll try to hit 5 pounds more, walk away. And then the following week, 5 pounds more, walk away. But of course, it's not always going to work like this 52 weeks out of the year. And this is kind of designed on purpose. So let's say they hit a true max effort lift, an RPE 10. The following week, I'll give them some type of sets and reps. So they'll do the same variation. The percentage will be based off of that max effort lift. And they might do like 80% for 4 doubles, 75% for 4 or 5 triples. Like depending on where we are in a phase, how much volume they can handle, how much volume I want them to work with. So a lot of times I'm picking the intensity based off of the technique that I see and how it's breaking down so that we can get good quality reps, very Shaco-like in this case. So there are times where lifters will have 0 max effort lifts in an entire week. So it just kind of like works itself out that we can have those psychological breaks from that max effort in there for a prolonged period of time, and it just kind of allows us to kind of put everything together. One of the things that, when you look at, I guess, the current state of powerlifting is higher frequency, sub-maximal work seems to be kind of a fad going on right now. But at the same time, many people are getting strong by utilizing some of those principles. So it's not something that I wanted to completely disregard. And I feel I kind of like meet in the middle with this. So our day 4, they get 50 reps of very light squats, very light deadlifts. I never want to see the RPE go above 7. And even then, most of the time, it's less than 6, less than 5. It's very light work, technique work, just building volume, building work capacity, conditioning. I think that day just allows the lifter also, with that increased work capacity and conditioning, to build the ability to recover from the work that I'm asking them to do during the week. And usually I will put some type of time limit on this so that they are moving a little bit quicker. I also think this helps for a meet because you're being told to go on somebody else's schedule, not your own. So I think that's an important concept. Now, one of the other things when you look at like a country like the Bulgarians, where they literally took a max single every day basically, right? But they had heuristics too, where they didn't allow stimulants, they didn't allow psychological arousal. So these are some of the lessons that I think are important for us to understand. Right? And like for me, it's hard for me to tell somebody not to drink coffee before they lift and things like that. Like I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think the bigger idea is giving the lifters tools so that they can handle the max effort lifts. So if you just give somebody a program where they're literally maxing out 3 times out of the week, every other week, and 2 times the other weeks. So where those numbers came from too. So Charlie Francis would have high intensity days 2 to 3 times out of the week. So if you have Olympic track athletes sprinting 100 meters and they're able to bring those intensities to the track 2 to 3 times a week, I think we can do the same thing in powerlifting. And I'll get to the absolute load things in a minute. I don't want to jump around too much. So, but giving the athletes the tools to psychologically handle those max efforts, right? Because I think the caffeine and the loud music and the psychological arousal and huffing ammonia, that becomes a problem when the lifter is doing it to mask their fear. So if they're scared of a certain weight or of missing or whatever they're afraid of, and they're just blasting their music to try to get that like feeling in their chest that they can handle this, and they're huffing ammonia and screaming, and if you're using it to mask your fear, that fear is still there and that fear is still gonna be a big part of that lift, and that fear is what makes it harder to recover from. So if you give the athletes the ability to handle their shit before they take a max effort lift, and they're much more calm and relaxed, and they kind of know how much arousal they need to get shit done in the gym, they're able to tolerate the max effort singles more frequently. So in the beginning, this might look like every other week they're getting max effort, or it might have to be spaced out a little bit. There are little tricks that you might have to use in the beginning. So one of the things that I think becomes really important, another heuristic, is how we handle absolute loads on the bar. So I never use comp squats or comp bench or comp deadlifts for our max effort lifts. It's extremely rare. I might give somebody like a sumo deadlift knowing that it's 10% weaker than their conventional deadlift or something. But heuristically, I try to keep all the max effort variations between 85 and 92% of their best comp lifts. So keeping the absolute loads down seem to allow for training to progress steadily, and the lifters tend to not be too beat up from it. So I think that's a really important heuristic to pay attention to. as those absolute loads start increasing, a couple of things have happened, right? For one, I think we can be, let's say that they're constantly hitting 95% in variations, 95% of their best comp lift. I'm pretty confident at that point that we have, I understand math doesn't work linearly in these things, but again, it's a heuristic, that we probably have 2.5% at least on a comp lift. Once they're more comfortable and our technique is sharp and all of those things, they probably definitely have 2.5%. But the other thing is those weights aren't going to be as stable yet. And because they are an overload and they are different than what the lifter's been used to, there is this getting used to process of those bigger weights. So if we have that sliding scale of bigger weights, there may need to be more rep work thrown in the middle. So one of the things, like with the Shaco program, after you test and you hit new maxes, that first month, that first 3 to 4 weeks was pretty brutal getting acclimated to the new numbers. So that's something that's always been in the back of my mind with doing these things. So as those weights start sliding up a little bit, we need to give the lifter time to adapt. So with Shaco, one of the times I hit a very large increase in I think it was my squat. And one of the things that he did is, I want to say it was like 20 kilos, is for the first 4 to 6 weeks, I added 10 kilos to my previous best. And then after that 4 to 6 week period, I added the other 10. So there was this gradual increase of that new max to work up into those loads, because recovering from it became very difficult. So these are things that the coach needs to take into consideration. If they're constantly hitting 95%, throwing in an extra week of reps and stuff like that, what we're trying to do is just maintain and stabilize at that point. We've got the PR. We know we have the PR. But maintaining and stabilizing becomes almost the goal. So every other week you could give reps just to kind of allow them to recover, get used to hitting those bigger weights, make it more gradual. And then once they're used to it, maybe you have a meet, you get new maxes, and then all the percentages kind of readjust. The other thing too is, like, sometimes you have to pay attention to the absolute loads with the squat and the deadlift, right? So if we're squatting and deadlifting in the same week, I probably can't do a ton of overload stuff with a squat getting, up into that 95% range, and then overloading a deadlift with like rack pulls just below the knees if they can lift 10% more. Like, the absolute loads do need to be taken into consideration. So I basically think of their squat, bench, and deadlift. And this is just a little heuristic that I've naturally paid attention to, and it just seems to kind of work across the board, that if they're maxing out on all 3 lifts in the week, I try to keep their total between 85 and 92% of their overall total. So if they crush a squat at the beginning of the week, depending on the lifter, because sometimes you can use blocks and they're just easy to recover from, especially if you're pulling sumo, and you can work on some weaknesses and stuff like that. But maybe we do a deadlift that, a deadlift with band, something that's a little lighter at the bottom, increases intensity as it comes up. Like, we do something where the absolute load, the weight on the bar, tends to be a little bit less, so that it keeps that total within that 85 to 92% range. I do think that that's really important. Occasionally, if it comes up, that's fine. But if we're constantly maxing out our 3 lifts and we're getting really close to our best totals, that's a lot of load for max effort lifts throughout a week that can really kind of fuck up the lifter's recovery. So these are just kind of like some things, and I think, you can see the high-low approach from Charlie Francis. You can see the frequency and the technique and the low RPE volume work that Shaco, the max effort stuff that Simmons talked about, and the exposures, like even Shaco in a comp cycle, like I said, like 3 out of those 5 to 6 weeks, you're hitting over 90%. So there are more exposures. It's just a lot more cluster, and it's almost like 1-to-1. If you have 1 month of volume work, 1 month of a comp cycle, or 2 months of volume work, 1 month of a comp cycle. Like, that stuff's important to keep in mind. And I think my goal now, as a younger coach, I think like I was saying before, I think I was trying to reinvent the wheel and come up with my own way and all of this stuff. And I think finally, like, after I got through those angsty teenage years, I came back around to realize the people that came before us know quite a bit about this stuff. And there's a reason why they've done it for 40 plus years at a very, very high level. So, I've come back to paying attention to what they did, building off of it. And then from here now, I think it's just a matter of like redefining things. Like, I'll keep reading, I'll keep an open mind, I'll keep trying new things. But I think it's just like redefining our programs to maybe have better heuristics, maybe, structuring it, long-term structuring of the plan is something that I'm really like trying to focus on right now, because it's easy just to go week to week without like a longer-term plan. And I've talked negatively about periodization, and I still think that the way it's explained in the literature has a lot of flaws. But I don't think we can just throw out the whole thing and not pay attention to long-term planning. I think, the amount of people who came before us that explained the importance of long-term planning, I think it's really important. So just developing those longer-term plans. So like one of the things, you can't just jump into a max effort program. You need to have the work capacity, the conditioning, the mental conditioning. So there are pieces that are necessary to build a foundation so that you can benefit from this program. We do back downs after our max effort work, so this is very different, right? It's more Shaco-esque, where I might squat, bench, squat on a given day, but now we have a max effort in a squat variation, and then we might drop it to, between 50 and 70% and do some sets and reps with it afterwards. I think it builds mental toughness. It builds technical work and makes sure you're staying fast, and it allows a small win. So if somebody misses a max effort lift and they get to do light work, they get to work on what they saw that broke down, and they can leave feeling good about themselves. And because I do feel having those small wins and building that momentum is extremely important, right? And this also is the coach's job to make sure that people understand that you're going to miss. It's okay, learn from it, move on. I think, you hit a PR, pat yourself on the back, but then move on. Like, we celebrate PRs, we learn from mistakes, and understand that that's how the training process goes. Guiding those expectations is extremely important, but it's also making sure that they're not getting super frustrated, disgruntled, feeling down, like those types of things. So allowing them to find those small wins. And that's some of the stuff that a lot of coaches talk about, but it's some of the stuff that I think I learned from playing sports as well. And obviously having the Shaco bias, we don't do a ton of bodybuilding stuff. Our accessories tend to be, we use a ton of variation within the lifts, but they tend to be, good mornings, back extensions, seated good mornings, reverse hypers. We do stuff like that, overhead press, floor press. But we don't necessarily do a ton of bodybuilding stuff because I just don't find a ton of efficacy in it. I think it has its place when we can't do the other stuff. So if somebody's feeling really banged up but they want to move around, I think it's great to, and there will be blocks where I'm like, hey, your day 4, just have some fun, do some bodybuilding stuff. Like, there are times we put it in because I think it's more important for the recovery of the lifter to do that instead of doing something that's, heavier, more complex, like those types of things. We'll do high rep reverse hypers with lightweight, back extension, stuff like that too. So it's not like we're not doing accessories. We're training all angles. We're training the body at all angles. We're using all rep ranges. We're taking a lot of what I've learned in the past, and we're just kind of putting it together and, continuing the path. We didn't create the path. We took the path, and now it's our turn to continue it to make those future strides. Questions? Did you even listen?
Yeah.
Yeah? But, I think that kind of sums up where we are now, and hopefully over time I can continue to add to this and let you know what we're messing around with in the gym, things that we're doing a little bit differently. I think having all these spots too, like, your max effort day doesn't necessarily, I have like Mike D'Amico's doing isometrics on his max effort day this week because he had pulled 700 pounds last week, which was an all-time PR. So I'm giving him very, very light rep work, but we're going to do some isometrics with like 315. They're hard, they'll tire him out. We're going to get some higher intensity work. Then he'll have rep work the following week. Like, we don't have to try to beat that 700 pounds. Because it's an all-time PR, I kind of want to limit the loads that he's under, but keep the intensity high. So there are all these like different scenarios that we mess around with, and like we'll find different spots for and how to, when this comes up, here's what's worked for us, here's what's worked for this person, for that person. And I'll explain a lot more of that process. But for now, you can follow me on Instagram. It's KWCan, our team, Precision Powerlifting Systems. You can follow Jay Birdie at Precision Powerlifting Systems. At Jay Birdie, JBURDIE.